Hi, I'm Malika Bilal. Today, owning up to decades of racist reporting in the pages of National Geographic. We'll look at the 130-year-old magazine's recent apology.
Hello, I'm Szabolcs Vörös, journalist of the Hungarian weekly Heti Válasz, and you are in the street.
How should media organizations atone for racist reporting of the past? National Geographic magazine recently apologized for a history of racism in its coverage of non-Western cultures and people of color around the world. In this month's special The Race issue, the publication said it could not cover stories about race without acknowledging its own past and upholding certain stereotypes. Here's editor-in-chief Susan Goldberg in an interview with PBS NewsHour.
So when we decided to do an issue devoted to race, I didn't think that we could do that in a credible way without looking at our own history. There's so much of our history that we are so proud of, that we have sent writers and explorers and scientists and researchers all over the world. But it did feel important to me, if we were going to look at race, that we look at some of the things that we weren't quite as proud of.
Well, known for its iconic photography, National Geographic had long portrayed non-white people as exotic, primitive, and uncivilized. As part of its own examination, the magazine asked photography historian John Edwin Mason to evaluate its coverage of people of color over the years and learn where it could have done better. So joining us to discuss his findings is John Edwin Mason, who teaches African history and the history of photography at the University of Virginia. Also with us from Stonington, Connecticut is Catherine Lutz, a professor of anthropology at Brown University. She co-authored the 1993 book, Reading National Geographic. And joining us in London is Shakuntala Banerjee, an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics. Now, we reached out to National Geographic for a representative to appear on this program, but they declined our offer. So welcome to all of our guests. And if you're watching us on YouTube, send us your comments, you're welcome, and your questions, and I'll try to get them into the show. You can also tweet us at AJStream. Now, John, how would you describe your relationship to the magazine, of which I have several issues here on my desk, because so many of us around the world know this magazine very intimately because we grew up with it. Were you a reader?
Sure, absolutely. I grew up in a middle-class American family, and if you grew up in a middle-class American family, very likely your parents subscribed to National Geographic. And also very likely they never threw it away. There was something iconic about the magazine, the physical magazine, that made it almost impossible for people to toss it out like they tossed out the newspaper. So yes, I grew up reading it. I enjoyed it as a child. As a child, it took me to places that I had never been. It showed me people I'd never seen before. The photography was fantastic, and I have to admit that I mainly looked at the photography. I don't think I read the stories very closely. And the fact that I eventually became a historian of photography partly has to do with the way that photography enchanted me when I was a kid, and the photography of National Geographic in particular. But I do have to say that I grew up as an African-American kid. And so in the back of my mind, I was troubled by the way that I saw people with brown and black skins being represented in the magazine. But I didn't have, at the time as a child, I didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't have the language to express those reservations.
So you mentioned the photography, and that is something that resonates with our community. This is a tweet we got from Denver and Cube, who says, there is much that has not been covered correctly or fairly when it comes to race. Hence, this narrative feeds the global image of so-called, quote-unquote, savage lands. Many people, unfortunately, had that narrative seared into their minds, and it drives prejudice. Shakuntala, can you relate to what he's saying of an image seared into minds of faraway places filled with savages?
Absolutely. And it doesn't just have to be an image filled with savages. I think one of the things one has to recognize is that you can have exotic images of things that look very beautiful and look very good, which might be the only image that somebody has in their head of a particular place. And it has a strange effect in that other places which are next to that place might be very, very similar, but don't get the same kind of coverage. And I'll give you the example, which is if you take the two countries, India and Pakistan, in the international media sphere, often India gets associated with beauty and peace and temples and the river Ganges, whereas Pakistan seems to be almost uniformly represented as somehow the birthplace of terrorism. And this is the case in South Asian media, it's the case in international Western media too. And when you talk to people and you say, what's your first thought? And you talk to students and you say, what's your first thought about these places? Peacefulness and spirituality spring to mind immediately relating to India, which is just as much a stereotype and just as much a deception as the notion that Pakistan is the birthplace of terrorism.
And John, I can see you nodding your head there. What did you learn that surprised you upon going back through the archives, through the photos, to do this research?
Well, I have to say that that tweet that you just showed us resonated tremendously with me, because I have two relationships with National Geographic, and one is that child who was enchanted by the magazine, and the other as the adult who sees it through critical eyes. And I agree entirely with that tweet. Now, when I was invited to go into their archives, I was happy to see that National Geographic was not defensive at all, and they welcomed me into their archives. But I frankly wasn't surprised by what I had seen, and that's partly because one of our guests, Catherine Lutz, co-authored a brilliant book about National Geographic that has become a classic, and that I certainly have read more than once, and I read it again in anticipation of going into the archive. So I was prepared for what I found. What was good to see was not simply images that had been published, but images that had been unpublished. So I was able to see how photographers were working. I was able to see how the editorial process worked. And it was an opportunity to do a really deep dive into National Geographic, its published volumes. So I read much more thoroughly than I had in the past.
So this conversation would be nothing without solid examples and images. And so, John,
Sure.
I'm going to take us through a couple of tabs here. And then, Catherine, if you want to jump in, because, of course, he referenced your work that so many have read on this topic, I welcome you to do that. So take a look here. This is from the archives. Timor Island warriors wearing silver breastplates crowd around the photographer to see his camera. This is just one example. Here's another. Cotton, the foremost fiber of the world. What are we looking at here, John?
Well, what we're looking at is a very stereotypical and frankly demeaning representation of African Americans in this particular issue, this particular image that's on the frame right now. And it harkens back to minstrel shows where African Americans were shown as happy in their oppression, as seen as musical, as seen as willing subordinates. It's an image that not only reproduces and reinforces, but naturalizes and legitimates a racially oppressive system. And, not only depicting African Americans as inferiors, but saying that this is a natural and a natural social system, and one that African Americans willingly accept. Right now, you're showing us an African American butler who's arranging things in a palatial house, and he's smiling as he does it. So he's sort of smiling in his subordination. These images recurred time and time again in the magazine, reinforcing in the minds of its readers that this was simply the natural and ordinary way that things were.
And this is a 1956 article that came from.
Too.
Catherine?
Well, I was going to say that first photo you showed of the camera is a very common trope. They would have many pictures of people with cameras, looking at cameras with sort of amazement, or looking in mirrors. And in a sense, some of the more subtle messages are about people of color around the world being without history, being sort of timeless and a timeless present. And some of the more subtle ways in which photographs communicate to us about race and reinforce ideas that are out there already in the readership about race. I think those are really important for people to learn how to see, because they're seeing them, but just not recognizing that they are.
Can I just jump in there about that photo that you mentioned? because the thing that strikes me about that is the fact that it's white people and technology. And this is a trope that we have been studying and seeing again and again through the years. And the frequency with which you see now someone with a wonderful camera as opposed to someone with some older technological tool, a hoe, a pick, some kind of scythe, or you see someone with new digital technology and a smartphone being looked at enviously by villagers in a place where they've never seen that before, or children who've never seen that before. This is carrying the idea that modernity is white, that modernity is technologized, that you can't have modern ideas or political systems which don't rely on these kinds of technological things. And I think a good example of that would be the way in which Facebook revolution became the trope which defined the Middle East in 2011, although it was decades and decades of people working in many different ways, using old media, using graffiti to try and galvanize a kind of resistance to oppressive regimes and to hunger and poverty. But none of that came across. It suddenly became Facebook and Twitter, which were Western inventions that became the story.
So Shakuntala, here's someone who might agree with you. This is a tweet from Kendi who says, for goodness sake, how is the apology that I'll mention in a minute, how is that supposed to help anyone? Nat Geo has entrenched the idea that only white people can discover, engage in conservation of any form, and that the darker races of Earth do not care about conservation. So that's just one example there.
Kendi.
But I want to move to this, this apology that this person references in their tweet, because of course we have this cover, which came out this month. This is the April 2018 cover. I'll show it to our audience right here. You can see it on my screen here, and it's gotten a lot of conversation going online. Here is just one of the tweets from someone that we'll recognize. Oprah Winfrey tweets in, I read every article. This issue was remarkable. Great job, Nat Geo. Of course, not everyone felt similarly. I want to share this article. This is from the New Yorker. The National Geographic twins and the falsehood of our post-racial future. John,
Sure, can I jump in there?
Prism. Yes, please. The floor is yours.
I think they're both right. And I think Oprah is exactly right. It's an extraordinary issue with extraordinary writers and extraordinary photographers of color and from around the world who are not pulling their punches in addressing issues of race. So much of the criticism of this issue of the magazine has been not addressed at the content of the magazine, but at the editor's letter and the story on the two little girls. Now, I think the story on the two little girls is poorly cast. The takeaway point is that race is simply a social construction, and so it doesn't matter. But of course, social constructions matter. Race is very powerful. It may be simply an idea. It may have no reality in biology, but it shapes the world in which people live. It shapes oppression. So I agree with the criticism of that video that so many people saw and the story about the two little girls, but I really encourage people to actually grapple with the content, the rest of the content of the magazine, which is really extraordinary for a popular magazine.
Yeah, I think it's great to encourage that closer reading. I think what we know about how people look at media is also important. So many people will have just seen that cover. They will have just gone to that story that feels comfortable, that feels like a feel-good story particularly for a wider audience. And I think that that understanding of how people, what kinds of information they might avoid and what kinds of information they prefer to look at helps explain both the history and maybe the present of the Geographic and other media.
So I want to share this tweet. Shakuntala, I'll go to you with this actually, but I want to share this tweet we got from our community. This is Alan. He says, I deeply appreciate that the editors of National Geographic's April issue on race begins with a clear and painful confession of how their magazine contributed to racism in America. If you haven't picked up a copy, I strongly encourage you to do so. This is a reply that he got from someone. This is Kelly. And Kelly says, I'm not trying to be rude, but my question would be, why did they think that highlighting these twins had anything to do with racism or even race? Because both of them are black. Actually, they're biracial, half black Jamaican descent and half white. But Shakuntala, do you want to take that on?
I'll take on the first tweet because I think it's really important to encourage self-reflection in large media organizations and whatever, and also to ask the question, why are they doing this and why now at this particular moment in history? So I think there's two things I'd like to say for anyone who has read the content, and I strongly encourage people to read the content rather than just looking at the cover and, of course, having a visceral reaction to the cover. And one thing is, we've often through history, and this happens a lot with the Second World War, we tend to defend the present by going back and apologizing about the past, but it's not good enough to say, once we acknowledge the past, everything's okay. You have to look at the way in which the past has shaped the present and the way in which present racist practices of representation are continuously reinforcing and also co-opting and reinventing new forms of Orientalism and new forms of racism. And it's not, and I think one of the things that I'd say is it's great that they've done this. It's just the tip of the iceberg. It's just a beginning. And people need to take it forward. And I mean people not just in Western media organizations, people in Asian media organizations. So for instance, looking at the way in which Indian media represents China. So the notion of self-Orientalism, the way in which China represents itself to the world in various programs or represents itself to itself. And media organizations, large news organizations tend to have stereotypes about the self, which are somehow building off of those historical stereotypes. They haven't gone away. They're just morphing into different forms.
So I want to bring in
one of the things that would really help is to have, I was going to say, to build on what Shakuntala just said, to have a visual literacy in the reading audience is really important, particularly when you're talking about photography. And so many of these images have incredible messaging that is, again, below the level of awareness, and to be able to pick apart the present, not, again, this very issue or many media outlets use imagery constantly. We're awash in images that many people do not know how to read for that kind of racist and Orientalist messaging that's in things like angle of view or shadowing or again, whether or not someone's represented with these tools of self-reflection, like a mirror or a camera. I mean, those are things I think we can expect media organizations to help do, not just to leave it to academics to talk to each other about it or to try and educate their students about it, but to have the media organizations themselves do that.
I agree.
Sure.
And can I ask a question to both of you? Because obviously you're in the US and I'm not, but I have a theory or a hypothesis about why it's at this particular historical juncture with this particular president.
Ooh,
that
I love it, because I was just about to ask that question. So please, by all means, go ahead.
Do you have your own hypotheses about why now and whose interests are served by doing this kind of very public apology? Not to say that it's a cynical ploy, but to say that it comes from a place of some desperation in the US.
Sure. I mean, one thing to say is that. Sorry,
John, you go first, and Catherine, you'll follow up.
One thing to say is that the race issue was in progress before Trump was elected president. And I think that the historical moment that we're in precedes Trump. And if you look around the American landscape, you find all sorts of institutions in the media, in the church, at universities, corporations that are looking at their past. Many universities in the United States right now are looking at the role of slavery in the history of their universities. Many churches are making confessions about the role that they played in supporting segregation in the United States. The New York Times has just started publishing a series of obituaries of women that they ignored when they had died. I mean, important, significant historical figures whose deaths were ignored. So this is a moment of reflection in American culture generally, but it actually precedes Trump. And I think that it might be more Obamian than it is Trumpian. But I absolutely agree with your point that confession is not enough, right? That one repents, but then one pledges to do better in the future. So the question now is, when a university or a magazine has said that we helped shape an oppressive racial climate, well, then what do you do about it, right? What is the next step? And so the question will be for my university, which is one of those universities that has acknowledged the role of slavery, and the question will be for National Geographic, what remedial steps do you take to change a social system that you were important in constructing, an oppressive social system that you were important in constructing.
And Catherine, before you,
Yeah, I
you
think one
answer
of the things-
Shakuntala, Catherine, before you answer Shakuntala's excellent question, if I do say so myself, I want to bring in this live comment that we got from YouTube. Elamite says, Nat Geo confront its racist past. How about the world confront its racist past? Nat Geo published magazines, for Christ's sake, and overall any racism was minimal compared to most publications at the time. And apologies for using Christ's name like that. Just reading out the comment. But Catherine, you published your book in 1993. Why has it taken until this year to get that apology? What do you think that has to do with?
Well, I think the National Geographic is a product. They sell it to an audience that they have to please in certain ways, and the racism. I think the person who's just written in is right. I mean, it is. We have to look at the audience that they're marketing to. They help create the audience, but the audience's racism, particularly when it was an all-white readership, which it was for many years, a mainly white readership, we have to ask about whether they're doing this now, making the apology now, because they want and need or have a wider readership than they did, and a readership that won't tolerate that same kind of treatment of people around the world, people of color, and are asking for a more accurate and more just kind of representation of themselves and people like them. So I think that's that question of the market and how the market is reshaping institutions like the Geographic. I mean, we don't have to be cynical to recognize that, but we do need to say, well, that helps us to see this relationship between the audience and its racism, which is not created entirely by the National Geographic. It's created by conflicts of interest, by histories of colonialism and slavery, and those are very big issues to tackle in media itself.
Can I just jump in with one point that we haven't raised, which I feel very strongly about?
Go ahead.
We can't, I mean, although I teach a lot of representation and I'm passionate about the politics of representation, I think there's absolutely no point having this conversation about the camera and what it produces unless we also have a conversation about who's behind the camera, the producers and the owners of media. And the narrowing field in which people are now, cross-media ownership means that the same platform, the same game, the same magazine might be owned by the same person with the same ideological outlook, with the same racist views. And I think this is a very, very dangerous thing. And unless we have diversity in production, you're never going to be able to change those mindsets and change those kinds of representations. Which means bringing
you're on the brainwaves are on the exact same level as our community members, because as you said that, I'm pulling up this tweet from Ida B. Wells, who is Nicole Hannah Jones. She's a New York Times Magazine reporter. She writes into the stream, what's the racial makeup of their staff? Contributors, photographers, that answers the question. So John, I wonder, are there checks in place now? Do you think that there's enough to make sure that this style of coverage that we've been talking about from National Geographic no longer exists?
Look, I don't know the internal makeup of National Geographic. I will say that in this particular issue, this particular race issue, you have photographers and writers of color who did extraordinary work. And for me, the challenge for National Geographic is now to assign these writers and these photographers to work on stories that have nothing to do with race. There's no, you don't want to compartmentalize these people, that they can only work on race. They can only work on what used to be called the Negro question. You want them to be able to work on anything that their talents make them appropriate for. And so we've shown that they can produce work and they can get it in on time, on deadline. Let's broaden the range of writers and photographers and editors who are responsible for producing this magazine.
So here's the headline once more. These twins, one black and one white, will make you rethink race. That is the premise there. We've heard what our guests had to say about that, but I'll end with this tweet from Alan, who says, it is not a perfect nor complete response to the depth of racism in our world, but I genuinely think it will move the conversation forward and deeper in an honest and thoughtful way. Our thanks to John Edwin Mason, Catherine Lutz, and Shakuntala Banerjee for this conversation, and of course to our community. It continues online with #AJStream. Thanks for being here.